In 1940, the British Army had a problem. Their tanks were getting bigger, heavier, and harder to move. And when a 30-ton tank throws a track or takes a shell in the engine compartment somewhere in the North African desert, you don't just leave it there. You need something to drag it out, something big. They found it in Chicago, of all places. Built by a company most people have never heard of, the Diamond T-980, the most capable truck of the Second World War. And almost nobody remembers it exists. To understand why this truck matters, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1940. Britain was alone. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The German war machine was rolling across Europe with terrifying efficiency, and the British military was staring down a logistics nightmare that most people never think about when they picture the war. Tanks break down constantly. People think of them as indestructible steel monsters, but the reality is far more mundane. They throw tracks, they overheat, transmissions fail, engines seize. They take hits that disable them without destroying them entirely. During the North African campaign, mechanical breakdowns would account for more tank losses than enemy fire on some days. And a disabled tank sitting in the desert or on a road somewhere in Europe isn't just a loss of one vehicle. It's a roadblock. It's a target. It's 30 tons of steel that your enemy can study, strip for intelligence, or turn into a fortified gun position against you. The ability to recover damaged armor quickly, sometimes under direct enemy fire, wasn't some nice-to-have logistical detail. It was a strategic necessity that could swing the outcome of an entire campaign. A tank repaired is a tank that fights again tomorrow. A tank abandoned is gone forever, and the crew who should be manning it is now sitting in a replacement depot, waiting for new equipment that might never arrive. And in 1940, the British didn't have anything that could do the job properly. Their existing recovery vehicles were underpowered, unreliable, and completely inadequate for the new generation of heavier tanks entering service. The Matilda alone weighed nearly 27 tons. The Churchill, coming into production, would weigh nearly 40. You couldn't drag these things with a standard truck and a tow chain. You needed a purpose-built machine. So the British Purchasing Commission came to America. They went door to door, manufacturer to manufacturer, looking at prototypes and production models, searching for something with the raw muscle to haul the heaviest armored vehicles in their inventory across any terrain in any condition. Most of what they saw wasn't up to the task. Too light, too fragile, not enough torque. Then they walked into a factory on the south side of Chicago. The Diamond T Motor Car Company had been building trucks since 1911. Before that, they built luxury touring cars, believe it or not. The founder, a man named Charles A. Tilt, had started the company in 1905 with about $1,000 in capital, working out of a corner of his father's shoe factory. The company name came directly from his father's business. The elder Tilt, a shoemaker, used a diamond shape around the letter T to mark his premium shoe line. Diamond for quality, T for Tilt. The son adopted the logo for his fledgling automobile company, and it stuck when he pivoted to trucks. Here's the thing about Diamond T. They were known across the American trucking industry as the Cadillac of trucks. Tilt had this saying he repeated to anyone who would listen. Trucks don't have to be homely. And he meant it. Diamond T trucks had flowing fender lines, aggressive grills, chrome touches on the headlights and running boards, accent striping on the cabs. They looked like somebody actually cared about aesthetics, but underneath the styling, they were built like bank vaults. Over-engineered frames, heavy-duty axles, components designed to last far longer than the competition expected. By the late 1930s, Diamond T was selling nearly 9,000 trucks a year and had a nationwide dealer network. By the time the British purchasing agents showed up in 1940, the company had already been supplying the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps for years. They understood military specifications. They understood what hard use looked like. They understood what breaks under stress and what doesn't. And as it happened, they had a prototype heavy prime mover sitting right there on the factory floor, something they'd been developing for the Army's own requirements. The British looked at it, asked for a handful of modifications to suit their specifications, and placed an initial order for 200 units, just like that. The result was the Diamond T Model 980, a 12-ton 6x4 ballast tractor designed from the ground up to haul tanks on trailers. And this is where the engineering genuinely earns your attention. The heart of the 980 was a Hercules DFXE diesel engine, inline 6-cylinder, naturally aspirated, displacing 895 cubic inches. That's 14.7 liters. For context, your typical modern full-size pickup truck runs a 5 or 6 liter engine, and people think that's big. This thing had nearly 3 times that displacement. It produced around 201 horsepower at 1,600 RPM, which sounds modest by today's standards, until you understand what this engine was actually designed to do. It wasn't about horsepower. It wasn't about speed. It was about torque. Low end, relentless, won't stop for anything torque. Nearly 700 foot-pounds of it at just 1,150 RPM. The kind of twisting force that turns wheels slowly but surely through sand, mud, gravel, or anything else the desert could throw at it. And here's a detail that historians of military vehicles find particularly interesting. This was one of the only diesel engines used in any American tactical truck during the entire war. Almost every other U.S. military vehicle, from Jeeps to deuce-and-a-halfs to the Dragon Wagon, ran on gasoline. The diesel was a specifically British requirement. They wanted the fuel economy, the mechanical reliability of a compression-ignition engine, and, critically, the reduced fire risk that comes with diesel fuel. The Hercules DFXE used Bosch fuel injection, which was cutting-edge technology for a truck engine in 1941. Some variants of the 980 actually received the Hall-Scott 440 gasoline engine instead, displacing 1,090 cubic inches and making 240 horsepower. That was the single largest gasoline engine fitted to any military truck in the entire Second World War. Either power plant gave you serious pulling capability. The transmission was where the real cleverness lived. A Fuller 4-speed main gearbox mated to a 3-speed auxiliary transmission. The main box had a very low crawling first gear, plus 3 road gears, with 4th being direct drive. The auxiliary offered low, direct, and overdrive ratios. Combined, this gave the driver 12 forward speeds to work with. In the lowest combination, the truck could crawl at walking pace with enormous mechanical advantage, essentially converting engine RPM into raw pulling force through shear gear reduction. In the highest combination, you could cruise at 23 to 25 miles per hour on a paved road. That was the absolute ceiling. This was not a vehicle that went fast. It was a vehicle that went everywhere, eventually with anything hooked behind it. The winch was a Garwood unit rated at 40,000 pounds of pulling force. On the original Model 980, it carried 300 feet of steel cable mounted mid-chassis behind the cab. On the later Model 981, which appeared in late 1942, that cable length was increased to 500 feet, and the cable could be routed through fairlead rollers in the front bumper as well as the rear. That single modification changed the vehicle's entire operational role. The 980 was a transporter. The 981 was a recovery vehicle. It could drive past a stuck or damaged tank, pay out cable behind it, and winch the casualty forward. It could pull itself out of trouble. It could, in the right hands, recover vehicles while staying partially behind cover. Behind the cab sat the ballast box, and this is where the whole engineering philosophy of the vehicle reveals itself. The 980 was a 6x4. Only the 2 rear axles were driven. The front axle just steered. That's a significant limitation when you're trying to haul 50 tons of dead weight through soft terrain. To compensate, you needed weight over those driven rear wheels to generate traction. The ballast box could hold 18,000 pounds of whatever happened to be available. Rocks, sand, scrap metal, concrete, whatever was heavy and nearby. In standard practice, crews routinely carried 5 one-ton precast concrete blocks stacked in the bed, just dead weight sitting there, doing nothing but pushing the rear tires down into the ground so they could grip. Think about that design choice for a moment. The truck itself weighed about 26,000 pounds. Then you added up to 18,000 pounds of ballast. That's 44,000 pounds before you've even hooked up a trailer. Then you coupled an M9 Rogers trailer carrying a damaged 33-ton Sherman, and the entire combination weighed well over 100,000 pounds. Rolling down a desert road at 25 miles per hour on air-powered drum brakes. The driver was perched in a cab with the aerodynamics of a filing cabinet, watching the temperature gauge and listening for anything that sounded wrong, knowing that if the brakes faded on a downhill grade, physics would become the only thing in charge. Paired with the 12-wheel M9 trailer built by Rogers, the system was officially designated the M19 Tank Transporter. The trailer featured tandem rear axles, a single front axle on a rotating dolly, and ramps that hinged down at the rear for loading. The entire combination could handle gross loads up to 115,000 pounds. That was enough for any Allied tank in service. Sherman, Churchill, Grant, Matilda, you name it. If it was broken down, bogged in, or shot up, the Diamond T could drag it out and haul it home. Production began in 1941 at the Diamond T factory in Chicago. The first batch of completed units arrived in Britain by early 1942, and they went straight into the fight in North Africa. The Western Desert Campaign was where the Diamond T earned its reputation, and it earned it the hard way. The Royal Army Service Corps operated these trucks with specially trained recovery crews, and the conditions they worked under were almost impossible by any reasonable standard. Daytime temperatures in the Libyan and Egyptian desert routinely exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Fine sand worked its way into every mechanical component, clogging filters and grinding down bearings. Vehicles sank in soft patches without warning, and recovery operations frequently happened within range of enemy artillery or under air attack, because a disabled tank sitting in the open is the definition of a target-rich environment for both sides. The Diamond T's diesel engine handled the heat where gasoline engines suffered from vapor lock and overheating. The low gearing meant it could crawl through soft sand at an agonizingly slow but unrelenting pace, maintaining traction where faster vehicles simply dug themselves in deeper. The winch could snag a crippled tank from hundreds of feet away, pulling it onto the trailer while the crew stayed as far from the exposed casualty as the cable would allow. Recovery teams learned to work quickly and methodically, assess the situation, choose your approach angle, hook the cable, engage the winch, get the damaged tank loaded and secured, and move. Every minute spent stationary in the open was a minute you were visible and vulnerable. Some recovery operations happened at night to reduce risk, the crews working by feel and instinct as much as by sight. The desert also tested the mechanical components in ways no proving ground could replicate. Fine Saharan sand, the consistency of talcum powder infiltrated everything. Air filters clogged constantly and had to be serviced daily, sometimes twice daily. The sand worked its way into wheel bearings, brake drums, and winch mechanisms. Maintenance crews became experts at field stripping and repacking components under conditions that would void any manufacturer's warranty. The Diamond T took the punishment. The Hercules diesel, with its relatively simple architecture and robust construction, proved far more tolerant of contamination than the more complex gasoline engines in other Allied vehicles. Parts that wore out could be replaced with standard components available through the supply chain. Nothing on the truck was so exotic that a well-equipped field workshop couldn't repair it. The math was simple and brutal. Every tank recovered was a tank that could be repaired at a rear area workshop and sent back into the fight within days or weeks. Every tank abandoned was a total loss, plus whatever intelligence the enemy could extract from it. In a campaign where both sides were constantly short of armor, the ability to recover and return damaged vehicles to service was a genuine force multiplier. The Diamond T didn't fire a single shot in anger, but the British crews who drove them arguably contributed as much to the campaign's outcome as many of the tanks they hauled. By the time production ended in May of 1945, Diamond T had built somewhere between 5,871 and 6,548 units, depending on which source you trust and how you count late assembly vehicles. They served with virtually every Allied army in every theater. The British took delivery of around 2,000 during the war. Some went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Others went to France and other Allied nations. They hauled tanks across North Africa, up through Italy, across France after D-Day, and into Germany itself. But here's the part that stings. The Americans didn't love their own creation. U.S. forces operating in the European theater compiled a list of complaints that reads like a performance review for a competent employee who just isn't quite right for the job. The turning radius was too wide for European village streets and narrow forest roads. The traction was limited because only the rear axles were driven, despite the ballast. The rolling resistance was excessive when pulling the M9 trailer in its standard towed configuration. The official Army assessment was blunt. The M19 did not meet the overall requirements of this theater. A functional tool, but not the right tool. Not anymore. So the U.S. developed the M25, built by Pacific Car and Foundry Company. 6x6 all-wheel drive, chain-driven tandem rear axles, an armored cab for battlefield use, and twin winches with a combined capacity of 60 tons. They called it the Dragon Wagon. It was bigger, heavier, more expensive, and significantly more capable in the churned-up mud and narrow roads of northwestern Europe. The Diamond T got pushed to secondary duty. After the Dragon Wagon arrived in numbers through 1944, the M19 was relegated to ammunition hauling in the rear communication zone. And ironically, it was spectacular at that job. When Army logistics officers described its performance hauling ammunition, the word they used was tremendous. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The technical story of why the Diamond T worked so beautifully for the British and fell short for the Americans comes down to mission profiles and engineering trade-offs that were baked into the design from day one. The 6x4 drivetrain was simpler, lighter, cheaper, and faster to produce than the 6x6 Dragon Wagon. Fewer drive shafts, fewer differentials, fewer universal joints, fewer things to break in the field. For the British operational concept, which centered on loading tanks at forward recovery points and hauling them back on roads to rear area repair depots, it was perfectly adequate. You recovered the tank, you drove on roads, you dropped it off at the workshop, you turned around and went back for the next one. The limited off-road capability wasn't fatal to that mission. The ballast system was a masterclass in simple physics. No complex all-wheel drive transfer cases required, no front differentials, no additional drive shaft running the length of the vehicle. Just add weight directly above the driven axles and let friction do the work. More normal force means more traction. It's the same principle that makes you put sandbags in the bed of a rear-wheel drive pickup in winter. Unsophisticated, effective. And the weight of 5 concrete blocks is a lot less likely to break down than a front differential assembly in the middle of the Sahara. The frame itself was a riveted ladder design, not welded, riveted. And this was not a cost-saving measure, it was a deliberate engineering decision. A riveted frame allows controlled flex under extreme loads, distributing stress across the joints rather than concentrating it at weld points that could crack. For a vehicle that spent its entire working life under maximum load, absorbing shocks from rough roads, potholes, and desert terrain. That flexibility was essential to longevity. The wheelbase measured 179 inches, front axle center to rear bogie center. 3 beam axles on leaf springs, with locating arms on the rear tandem. Bud split rim disc wheels carried 1220 by 20-inch tires, with dual mud and snow tires on all 4 rear positions. Nothing exotic, everything proven, everything repairable with standard tools by a competent mechanic working out of a field workshop. The braking system used compressed air-powered drums on all 6 wheels, with the trailer brakes independently controllable. That independent control mattered enormously. When you're piloting a 100,000-pound combination downhill on a desert track, the ability to apply trailer brakes separately from the tractor brakes gives you fine-grained control over weight transfer and stability. Get it wrong, and the trailer starts pushing the tractor. Get it very wrong, and the whole rig jackknifes. RASC drivers who mastered these systems developed a tactile understanding of the vehicle's behavior that took months to acquire. A transmission parking brake with a 16-inch disc and 4-pad cable clasp mechanism held the whole assembly stationary on grades. Simple, reliable, strong. Converting the standard M19 from a towed trailer configuration to a semi-trailer setup, something field workshops experimented with, improved fuel economy by roughly 50%, according to Army evaluations. It also improved handling and reduced some of the rolling resistance issues. Practical engineering, done in the field, by people who use the equipment every day. When the war ended, the Diamond T story was supposed to be over. It wasn't. The British Army kept them in frontline service. The Thornycroft Antar, the mighty Antar, started arriving as a replacement in the early 1950s. But some Diamond Ts remained active with tank transporter units well into the 1960s. A few hung on until 1971, 30 years of continuous military service from a truck designed in 1940 and built in a Chicago factory that would eventually become a parking lot. Then came the second act. Surplus Diamond Ts were bought by heavy haulage operators across Britain almost the moment they became available. Wynns, one of the legendary names in British heavy transport, eventually operated 30 of them. Pickford's, the most famous name in British haulage, a firm that traces its roots to 1646, ran 12. Smaller firms bought them too, 1 or 2 at a time, recognizing that nothing else available on the civilian market could match their pulling power at anything close to the price. These trucks moved industrial transformers from factories to substations. They hauled turbine components to power stations. They carried bridge sections and oversized machinery from foundries to dockside loading cranes. On one documented occasion, a convoy of 5 Pickfords, Diamond Ts, moved a gross load of 245 tons from Sheffield to the Liverpool docks. 5 trucks, each more than a decade old by that point, working in concert to move a load that would strain modern specialist equipment. They became fixtures on British roads. Fairground showmen bought them to haul rides and equipment from town to town through the summer season. Recovery operators converted them into heavy-duty wreckers and parked them on garage forecourts, ready for the call when a lorry ended up in a ditch or a bus went off the road. If you grew up in Britain in the 1950s or 60s, there's a reasonable chance you saw one lumbering past and didn't know you were looking at history. Meanwhile, the company that built them was slowly disappearing. C.A. Tilt retired as president after the war, handing the firm to his younger brother Ned. The post-war trucking market was consolidating rapidly, and Diamond T's commitment to quality and craftsmanship couldn't compete with the economies of scale that larger manufacturers commanded. White Motor Company acquired Diamond T in 1958. The name survived as a division for a few more years. Then, in 1967, White merged it with another acquisition, Rio Motor Company, creating Diamond Rio. The last trucks bearing the Diamond T name alone rolled off the line in 1966, a company that produced over 50,000 military vehicles during the war, including more than 12,000 half-tracks and thousands of the most capable heavy trucks ever assembled, was absorbed, diluted, merged, and forgotten. The factory is gone. The brand is gone. But the trucks themselves refuse to die. Today, dozens of Diamond T 980s survive in private ownership, concentrated heavily in Britain, where they served longest and were loved most. They appear at historic vehicle rallies, military preservation events, and steam fairs, restored to better-than-new condition by people who understand what these machines meant. Some wear desert sand paint with Royal Army Service Corps markings, the gold camel badge of GHQ Middle East Forces on the front wing, and the white diagonal cross on the cab roof that identified them from the air. Others carry the distinctive livery of Pickfords or Winds, honoring their civilian careers. A few remain fully operational, their Hercules diesel engines still turning over after more than 80 years, pulling demonstration loads at shows while spectators who have never heard of them stop dead and stare at the sheer physical presence of the thing. You can buy spare parts if you know where to look. You can still find someone in the British military vehicle community who knows how to rebuild a Fuller auxiliary transmission or repack a Garwood winch. The knowledge hasn't completely vanished. Not yet. The engineering principles behind the 980 aren't exotic. Low gearing, a torquey diesel engine, a strong riveted frame, and enough dead weight to maintain traction on the driven axles. Nothing revolutionary on paper, but the execution was extraordinary. Diamond T built a machine that did exactly what it was supposed to do, in conditions that destroyed lesser equipment for decades longer than anyone involved in its design had any right to expect. The modern military logistics industry owes more to vehicles like the 980 than it typically acknowledges. The entire concept of rapid armored vehicle recovery, of keeping fighting assets in the field by hauling damaged machines to repair facilities rather than writing them off, was proven operationally by the Diamond T in the deserts of North Africa. Every heavy equipment transporter that followed, from the Thornycroft Antar to the modern Oshkosh heavy equipment transporters, traces its operational doctrine back to what those RASC crews figured out in 1942. Wrestling broken Shermans and battered Grants onto Rogers trailers under the Libyan sun, the mechanics and drivers of the recovery companies wrote the book on armored logistics. They just did it in a truck that history forgot to remember. The Diamond T 980 was never the fastest truck on any road it traveled, never the most powerful vehicle in any convoy it joined, never the most glamorous machine on any battlefield. It wasn't even the preferred choice of its own country's military once something better came along. But it showed up every time, when everything depended on it. It hauled the tanks that turned the tide in the Desert Campaign, and then it hauled transformers and fairground carousels and broken-down lorries for another 3 decades after that, and then it retired gracefully into the hands of people who understood that some machines deserve to be preserved long after the companies that built them are gone. A shoe factory logo on a truck built by a car maker from Chicago, dragging British tanks through the Sahara. You couldn't write it as fiction. Nobody would believe it. And there you have it, the Diamond T 980. A truck that saved more tanks than most weapons destroyed, built by a company the world forgot. If you've ever seen one in person or your family had any connection to these machines, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.